Hi class, in this recording we are going to focus on muscular tissue and nervous tissues. And when we look at both muscular and nervous tissues, there's something that they each have in common. They are both excitable. They have the ability to conduct electric signals. They can respond to an electric stimulus. And this ability of conducting electric signals is referred to as changing membrane potential. And we have lots of this in the nervous and muscular tissues. Yes, every tissue of our body technically does have some kind of voltage across its membrane. But muscular and nervous tissues are special because these tissues are designed to alter or fluctuate their voltages across their membrane. This membrane potential is usually going to be measured in millivolts, lowercase m, capital V for millivolt. Nerve cells or neurons are going to have very rapid changes in voltage and can transmit these signals to other cells in response to these changes in voltage. Usually it's either going to be via neurotransmitters, or we're going to have occasionally electric synapses, as we look at muscle cells. Generally speaking, when we look at a muscle cell, in response to a voltage fluctuation, muscle cells are typically not going to propagate that voltage fluctuation or propagate that membrane potential fluctuation. Instead, muscle cells are usually going to contract or become shorter in response to electrical stimulation. So they're both electrically active. They both can conduct electricity across the membrane of one individual cell. But nerve cells can go from one nerve cell to the next nerve cell, transmit that electrical signal, whereas most muscle cells will not transmit the electrical signal to an adjacent muscular cell. As we look at our nervous tissues are some of the most specialized tissues in our body because they transmit electrical signals via electrical synapses and chemical synapses. And these electrical and chemical signals that are propagated within the nervous tissue allow for us to process information, to think. This is how we are, who we are. So the cells of our nervous tissue that do most of this electrical activity or have most of this electrical activity associated with them are referred to as neurons. And they're kind of like the rock stars of the nervous system. Everybody focuses on the neurons and fixates on the neurons, myself included, because they are such a significant cell type in our nervous tissue. Our neurons can detect stimuli. They can rapidly process that stimuli and then transmit that information to adjoining cells. But the most common kind of cell in our nervous tissue is not a neuron. Instead, it's the neuroglia, aka the glial cell. And these are the assistants, so to speak. So when we think of the neuroglia, or the glial cells help the neurons to do a really good job of receiving, processing, and sending information. And we have many more neuroglia than neurons, easily 10 times the number of neuroglia compared to neurons within our bodies. As we look at a neuron, the cell body of the neuron is referred to as a neurosoma, and then there are small extensions coming away. Some of the extensions carry signals to the neuron. Those are referred to as the dendrites. And then an extension may carry a signal away from the neurosoma. That is referred to as the axon. Oh, looks like I stole my thunder here. So yeah, the neurosoma is the cell body of the neuron, and it's going to have lots of protein synthesis in addition to housing the nucleus and other major organelles. When we think of those dendrites, they receive signals, and there's typically more than one dendrite per neuron. And when we look at those axons, they send signals away, and there's typically only one axon, if there is an axon present, and the axon can be enormous. It can be over 1 meter in length. And another way to think of an axon is these axons, these really long fibers or strings coming from all these individual neurons, are referred to as nerve fibers, and they can be bundled together to make, and then we can have these bundles of axons, which we call nerves in our body, at least if they're in the peripheral nervous system. We'll get more to that later. Last unit in this class, we'll talk about that. Let's shift gears and focus on muscular tissue. Muscular tissue It's going to have some elongated cells, which are going to be able to contract when they're exposed to some kind of an electrical stimulation. And I need to emphasize they contract, they contract, they contract. They never push, they only pull. So as these muscles are contracting or pulling, they can exert some physical force on nearby tissues. Almost always it's going to be a skeletal muscle tissue exerting force onto compact bone tissue. Occasionally there'll be smooth muscle tissues within an organ, a squishy organ of the intestinal tract or the respiratory tract, or we could have cardiac muscular tissue within the heart itself. Whenever these muscles are contracting, we're going to have movement. We can move the limbs, we can move fluids, we can breathe in and out, we can talk, all kinds of great things happen, all kinds of wonderful movements happen in our bodies. Something else our muscular tissue is really important for is heat generation. We make heat by moving our bodies. That's a key thing that we'll come back to when we get to the muscular system. So let's look at our three kinds of muscular tissue, our skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle tissues. Skeletal muscle tissue is by far the most common, and the skeletal muscle fibers are incredibly long. These muscle cells are referred to as myocytes. Sometimes they're referred to as muscle fibers as well, and they can be 30 centimeters long in some instances. So they can be long enough that you can see the length of it with your gross eye. And this muscle cell, because they're so long, one individual nucleus within the cell isn't capable of controlling it and sending and receiving all the signals needed to keep the entire cell alive. So these very long cells get around that rate of diffusion problem by having multiple nuclei scattered throughout the length of the cell itself. To allow these cells to contract with a lot of force, there are contractile units, and those contractile units, if you zoom out a little bit, are going to make striations. The contractile unit itself is called a sarcomere. We'll get more on that one later in our muscular unit. But the striations themselves, I want you to think of stripes, this striped pattern of the muscle cells, or the myocytes. Something else that I want to emphasize about skeletal muscles is that they are voluntary. We have conscious control over whether or not we can contract or relax our skeletal muscle tissues. Our next tissue type is cardiac muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue is kind of the in-betweeny. It's an in-between of skeletal and smooth muscle tissues in terms of characteristics, because we need a little bit of everything with our cardiac muscle tissue. We need the strength of the skeletal muscle tissue, but we need the endurance of the smooth muscle tissue. So our cardiac muscle tissue will have some striations, like smooth muscle does, so we can have lots of contractile force, but our cardiac muscle tissue will also have more endurance, like smooth muscle does. So what we end up with cardiac muscle tissue is an intermediate amount of contractile force and an intermediate amount of endurance. When we look at skeletal muscle, we have incredibly high contractile force and incredibly low endurance. And if I fast forward here to smooth muscle tissue, smooth muscle doesn't have any striations. It generates hardly any contractile force, but it has tons of endurance. It can contract for hours at a time, active contractions. Now let's go back to cardiac muscle tissue. As I look at this cardiac muscle tissue, it's going to be in the heart. Cells are called cardiomyocyte, cardio for heart, myo for muscle, cyte for cell. It's the heart muscle cell, cardiomyocyte. And these cardiomyocytes are going to have a very special kind of cell-to-cell junction. They have an electrical synapse, so that electrical signals, these electrical stimulations that contract one cardiomyocyte, can branch to immediately go to the next cardiomyocyte. And because the cardiomyocytes are branched, if one of them contracts and has an electrical signal, one contracting cardiomyocyte can send action potential to multiple adjacent cells, so we can multiply and propagate electrical signals. Connecting one cardiomyocyte to another cardiomyocyte, there's a special junction called an intercalated disc, which allows for the cytoplasm of one cardiomyocyte to smoothly flow into the adjacent cardiomyocyte. I need to emphasize that cardiomyocytes are involuntary. We do not consciously constrict or contract our cardiomyocytes. That'd be kind of funny, though. If we had to think about beating our heart once every other second or so, that'd take a lot of mental energy. Let's move on to smooth muscle tissue, our last slide of this presentation. Smooth muscle tissue has fusiform cells. And when we say fusiform, we're just saying that they start out pointy, they get wide in the middle where the nucleus is, and then they end pointy. So they start pointy, widen in the middle, and end pointy. That's a fusiform shape. We need to emphasize that that smooth muscle cardiomyocytes are involuntary, and they make up most of the muscles of the abdominal pelvic cavity. So most of the organs of our abdominal pelvic and thoracic cavity, I should also add, pretty much any hollow organ is going to have a bunch of smooth muscle making up the wall of that hollow organ. As you look at these photomicrographs of the smooth muscle, I want you to fixate on the fact that even the nuclei of the smooth muscle tends to be elongated, just like that smooth muscle is as well. And also look at the distribution of the nuclei. The nuclei have a much more even distribution and a much higher density compared to other tissue types like dense regular connective tissue, which I see students commonly mixing up with smooth muscle tissue. If you have any questions or comments about nervous tissue or muscular tissue, please feel free to post them in our class discussion board or shoot me an email. And as always, class, happy studies.